The morning sun broke across the Pacific, January 5, 1943, casting shadows that stretched like fingers over the deck of USS Helena. Sailors moved with practiced tension. Radar operators hunched in the glow of their screens, eyes scanning for death that could drop from the sky at any second. This was the new rhythm of war in the Pacific, brutal and unforgiving, where every heartbeat could be your last. Helena had spent the night hammering Japanese positions at Munda Airfield on New Georgia, her guns roaring into the darkness. And now, Task Force 67.2 was pulling back south through waters that belonged to no one. The crew stayed sharp, wired on coffee and adrenaline, because they'd learned the hard way that payback came fast and vicious after raids like this. Then, the horizon changed. 4 silhouettes appeared against the morning glare, wings catching light, unmistakable shapes cutting through the sky. Japanese dive bombers, Aichi D-3A aircraft, the ones the Allies called VALs. Older planes, slower than the newer models, but deadly accurate when flown by men who knew their business. The alarm split the air like a blade. Battle stations. Every gun crew scrambled, boots pounding steel, hands grabbing ammunition, bodies moving with muscle memory drilled into them through months of drills and near misses. The Japanese planes peeled off into their dives, gravity and momentum pulling them toward the American ships below. And their bombs found HNNZS Achilles, fire and twisted metal marking their success, before they banked hard and climbed away, thinking they'd escaped, thinking they were out of range. What happened next rewrote the rules, as those Japanese bombers clawed for altitude, believing the American guns couldn't touch them anymore. Helena's 5-inch guns spoke. Not the desperate hurricane of fire that doctrine demanded, just a few shells, carefully aimed, tracking targets now more than 4 miles distant. The gun crews watched their rounds arc upward, streaking toward those shrinking dots against the blue. And then the impossible happened. The shells exploded in mid-air, near the planes but not hitting them. Close enough that one bomber erupted into flames and spiraled down trailing black smoke, followed seconds later by another, both plunging into the ocean in geysers of white foam. The sailors stood frozen, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. They'd shot down enemy aircraft at a range that shouldn't have been possible, killed them without direct hits, watched shells explode automatically when they came close to their targets. No frantic calculations, no guessing about altitude or speed, no setting fuses based on estimates that were usually wrong. The weapons had simply known when to detonate, had sensed their prey, and struck with precision that felt like science fiction. Commander W.S. Parsons documented the engagement with the careful language of a man who understood he'd witnessed history turning. These weren't lucky shots scattered by chance. These were precision kills, achieved by a weapon that detected its own proximity to the target and detonated at exactly the right moment to shred aircraft with fragments. What those sailors had just used was a secret guarded more jealously than almost anything else in the American arsenal, second only to the atomic bomb in security classification. A weapon so revolutionary that military leaders feared its capture more than they feared losing battles. A device that would prove 3 to 4 times more effective than anything that came before. Yet despite its power to save American lives by the thousands, the highest levels of command would refuse to authorize its use on land for nearly 2 years, keeping it locked away while soldiers died under fire that could have been stopped. This is the story of the proximity fuse, the weapon the Navy hoarded like treasure, the innovation that Pentagon brass deemed too dangerous to risk, and the secret that would ultimately help turn the tide of World War II when desperation finally forced their hand. To understand why commanders would restrict such a devastating weapon, you first need to understand what made it so extraordinary. Why shooting down aircraft before 1943 was an exercise in mathematical futility and wasted ammunition. The problem was brutally simple. The sky is vast. Aircraft are small and fast, moving in 3 dimensions with speeds that made prediction nearly impossible. And artillery shells, once fired, followed a ballistic path that couldn't be changed. Traditional anti-aircraft guns relied on two types of fuses, both deeply flawed. Contact fuses only detonated on direct impact, which meant hitting a fast-moving target at ranges often exceeding several miles, and the odds of success were vanishingly small, almost negligible. Time fuses exploded at a predetermined moment after firing, set before the gun, fired based on calculations that had to account for the aircraft's altitude, speed, direction, rate of climb or descent, wind conditions, and the shell's trajectory, and any error even by fractions of a second meant the shell exploded harmlessly in empty air, while the enemy flew past untouched. The statistics were grim enough to make you sick. Early in the war, it took an estimated 20,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition to destroy a single enemy aircraft, and some reports from Norway and Britain suggested figures as high as 100,000 rounds per kill. Even the best gun crews, men who'd been doing this for years, needed at least 2,500 rounds to bring down one plane. Ships returned to port with their magazines empty, and enemy aircraft still owning the skies. And the human cost was measured in burning vessels and sailors drowning in oil-slicked water. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes tore through American naval forces in the Pacific, at Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea, at Midway, killing sailors because their guns couldn't reliably stop the attacks. German aircraft hunted convoys crossing the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships loaded with supplies desperately needed in Britain and Russia. And Allied defensive weapons were barely more effective than throwing stones. Scientists and military planners across every warring nation knew there had to be a better way. And the concept of a proximity fuse, a shell that could detect its target and detonate automatically at optimal distance, had been discussed in journals and laboratories for decades. The British started preliminary research in 1939 as German air power grew. The Germans themselves had launched at least 30 different proximity fuse programs. Some sources document as many as 50. The Japanese experimented with acoustic and magnetic detection. Everyone saw the potential. But seeing potential and creating a working weapon were separated by chasms of technical impossibility. The Germans had been particularly aggressive, initiating between 30 and 50 proximity fuse research programs by 1940. Including the Kranish acoustic fuse developed by Rheinmetall AG that tried to detect aircraft by sound, the Fuchs program at AEG Berlin, exploring radio proximity detection, similar to what the Americans would eventually perfect, the Grimm project investigating electromagnetic detection, and Rheinmetall Borsig, working on the Kugelblitz electrostatic fuse, designed to detect electrical field changes caused by approaching aircraft. Despite all this research, German programs were killed in 1940 by direct order from Hitler, who demanded all research focus on projects that could reach production within 6 months. A decision driven by overconfidence after early victories that would prove catastrophic. When German research finally resumed in 1944, as their situation deteriorated, it was too late. Rheinmetall had actually test-fired working prototypes by late 1944, but their facilities were overrun before production could begin, and not a single German proximity fuse saw combat, while Americans produced 22 million. The Japanese understood the concept perfectly through their Naval Technical Research Institute, but they lacked the industrial infrastructure for miniaturized electronics. Their vacuum tubes were larger, less reliable, couldn't withstand the stresses involved. And their best efforts produced laboratory curiosities with no path to mass production. A proximity fuse would need to contain a miniature radar system capable of detecting aircraft and calculating distance in real time. And this entire system would have to fit inside an artillery shell only 5 inches in diameter. The components would need to survive acceleration forces of 20,000 times gravity when fired. The shell would spin at 25,000 revolutions per minute, creating massive centrifugal forces. The device would need to function in rain, snow, tropical humidity, Arctic cold, and the chaos of combat. And it would need to be cheap enough to manufacture by the millions. Most experts considered it impossible with existing technology because vacuum tubes, the basic building blocks of all electronics in that era, were delicate glass containers that shattered under far less stress than artillery shells endured. Batteries powerful enough to run a radar system were too large to fit in a shell nose. The radar antenna would need to be impossibly small yet functional. Safety mechanisms had to work perfectly every time without exception, because one failure could kill the entire gun crew. And all of this had to be crammed into a space smaller than a coffee can, and then fired from a gun with explosive force. The British shared their early research with American scientists in September 1940 through the Tizard mission, a desperate intelligence exchange as Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. And Sir Henry Tizard arrived in Washington carrying a black metal deed box containing many of Britain's most closely guarded military secrets. Among the documents were preliminary proximity fuse designs, theoretical calculations, and reports on failed experiments. But British scientists admitted they lacked both industrial capacity and specialized knowledge in miniaturized electronics to turn theory into mass-produced reality. Their factories already stretched beyond capacity, producing conventional weapons. The challenge fell to American researchers, and the National Defense Research Committee, formed June 27, 1940, assigned the project to Dr. Merle Tuve at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University. The choice was inspired because Tuve was a physicist who'd spent years studying the ionosphere using radio waves, giving him exactly the background needed, and he assembled a team of physicists, engineers, and inventors from universities and private industry who worked under conditions of absolute secrecy that rivaled the Manhattan Project itself. The project received security classification second only to the atomic bomb. Workers in factories often had no idea what they were building. Components were manufactured separately with deliberately misleading names, and the fuse was given the intentionally vague code name, Variable Time, abbreviated VT, to hide its true nature even from most military personnel who would handle it. Section T, as Tuve's group became known, faced one technical crisis after another, each problem solved, revealing two new challenges. And the team initially consisted of just 4 scientists in August 1940, but would eventually grow to nearly 1,000 researchers and support staff. They worked in converted buildings at Johns Hopkins and the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution, under security so tight that different teams working on components often had no idea how their work related to other parts of the project. Standard vacuum tubes shattered instantly under the massive acceleration forces of gunfiring, and early tests were disasters. In one documented test, engineers fired a standard radio tube from a gun and recovered only glass powder and twisted wire. Even tubes marketed as ruggedized and used in oil drilling equipment failed catastrophically because the acceleration was so violent that glass would flow like liquid. Internal elements would telescope into each other. Delicate wire grids would collapse instantly. The breakthrough came through partnership with private industry as Sylvania Electric Products, working with Section T engineers, developed special miniaturized tubes with reinforced glass, multiple support structures, and shock-resistant internal components, unlike anything previously manufactured. They started with hearing aid tubes, the smallest available, and modified them extensively with additional glass supports at critical stress points. Lead wires shortened to just 3/8 of an inch to reduce flexing, special tungsten alloy filaments replacing standard materials, and the tubes filled with special gas mixtures at precise pressures to prevent electrical arcing under stress. But even these improved tubes failed repeatedly in early tests. And in one particularly frustrating series of experiments in late 1941, 900 consecutive tubes were destroyed without a single success. Engineers tried everything imaginable: embedding tubes in wax that melted from heat, oil that leaked, rubber compounds that deteriorated, plastics that cracked under stress. One engineer suggested suspending tubes in mercury, which was too heavy. Another proposed using human blood plasma as cushioning, which was tested but proved impractical. The solution came from Dr. James Van Allen, who would later discover the Van Allen radiation belts, then a young physicist on the team who suggested using a wax and oil combination in precise ratios with tubes mounted at specific angles to distribute stress. After thousands of configurations, they found that tubes mounted at 30 degrees to the shell's axis, cushioned in a mixture of ceresin wax and transformer oil, could survive about 70% of test firings deemed acceptable for a wartime production. The battery problem seemed equally insurmountable until engineers created a tiny glass ampule containing liquid electrolyte that sat inert until the shell was fired. And when the gun fired, the massive acceleration shattered the glass, and centrifugal force from the shell's spin drove the liquid outward to contact carefully positioned metal plates. This initiated a chemical reaction generating electrical current, the battery literally activating itself through the very forces that threatened to destroy it. Elegant engineering using the problem as its own solution. The radar system required innovations pushing the boundaries of electronics technology because traditional radar systems were enormous installations weighing tons, while the proximity fuse radar had to fit in a space the size of an ice cream cone. The transmitter and receiver had to share a single tiny antenna, no larger than a pencil. The circuitry needed to distinguish between the radio signal it transmitted and the much weaker reflection bouncing back from the target. And Section T engineers developed an ingenious autodyne detector circuit that could sense minute changes in signal strength as the shell approached its target. When the reflected signal exceeded a specific threshold indicating the target was within lethal range of the shell's fragments, the firing circuit would trigger detonation. But detecting proximity alone wasn't enough because the fuse had to be smart enough to avoid false triggers. A shell fired over water couldn't be triggered by reflections from ocean waves. A shell fired in rain couldn't mistake water droplets for aircraft. A shell passing near friendly aircraft had to distinguish friend from foe, though this proved impossible and led to strict usage protocols. Engineers added sophisticated wave suppression circuits that ignored long-duration signals from stationary surfaces while remaining sensitive to characteristic reflections from moving aircraft. They built in time delays so the fuse couldn't arm until the shell traveled safely away from the firing ship. And the arming sequence was complex, requiring multiple conditions met in precise order. Safety mechanisms had to be redundant and absolutely foolproof because the fuse remained completely inert. Until fired, the battery contained no active chemicals until the ampule shattered. The arming circuit required both battery activation and minimum time of flight, typically 700 yards from the gun. The radio transmitter powered up only after the shell spun up to correct rotational speed using a centrifugal switch, and multiple independent systems had to align perfectly before the weapon became dangerous. One failure in any safety circuit meant a dud shell falling harmlessly into the ocean, protecting both the gun crew and the secrets inside the fuse. The first successful test came by August 12, 1942, when the newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted live fire tests in Chesapeake Bay during its shakedown cruise using radio-controlled drone aircraft as targets. And the results exceeded all expectations as gunners shot down 3 drones with just 4 bursts on the first day. The drone aircraft were small, fast, maneuvering, yet the proximity-fused shells destroyed them with ease. And the test was so successful, the Navy canceled the planned second day of testing and immediately ordered mass production. By January 1942, after 18 months of intensive work involving thousands of experiments, the team had produced fuses exceeding 50% reliability in test firings. And by peacetime standards, this would have been unacceptable. But with American forces suffering severe losses to enemy air attack, 50% reliability of a revolutionary weapon was deemed acceptable. Production of the Mark 32 VT fuse began November 1942, and the first operational fuses reached Pearl Harbor that same month, traveling under heavy guard in sealed containers. The Pacific Fleet receiving 4,500 fuses by year's end, distributed only to select cruisers and battleships. Navy security protocols surrounding the new weapon were extraordinary and unprecedented because VT-fused shells could only be fired over deep water, exceeding 100 fathoms, where any dud failing to detonate would sink to the ocean floor, taking its secrets beyond enemy reach. Ships received strict orders never to use fuses where they might fall on land or shallow water, with penalties for violation, including potential court-martial. Commanding officers had to personally approve each use. Fuses were stored in special magazines under Marine Guard. The technology simply too valuable to risk any possibility of capture. In early January 1943, Helena put the new fuses to their first real combat test off Guadalcanal, and the results exceeded all expectations as the ship's gunners fired only 22 rounds, achieving 2 confirmed kills at ranges previously thought impossible. A gunnery report filed after the engagement stated the value of the Mark 32 fused projectile cannot be too highly stressed, and the Bureau of Ordnance had been waiting anxiously for exactly this kind of combat confirmation. Production ramping up immediately, with contracts expanding from $60 million to over $200 million within months. Throughout 1943, VT-fused ammunition proved itself in battle after battle across the Pacific, as ships firing these shells downed enemy aircraft with unprecedented efficiency. And during 1943, naval guns fired 36,370 anti-aircraft rounds. Although only 25% used proximity, fuses these shells accounted for 51% of all aircraft destroyed. The mathematics were stunning and undeniable, because time-fused shells required an average of 508 rounds to destroy one aircraft, while proximity-fused shells required only 155 rounds per kill. The new technology, more than 3 times as effective as conventional ammunition. The lethal fragment area comparison told an even more dramatic story, because a 5-inch time-fused shell, if it exploded at exactly the right moment and position, could spray lethal fragments across roughly 60 square feet, requiring perfect timing rarely achieved in combat, while a proximity-fused shell created a lethal kill zone of 3,000 square feet, guaranteed to detonate at optimal distance from the target. The effective target area had become 50 times larger from the perspective of the explosive, and an aircraft that would have flown safely past a time-fused explosion now flew directly into a cloud of deadly shrapnel. Night engagements revealed another crucial advantage, because time fuses required accurate range and altitude data to set detonation time, and at night, without visual confirmation, these calculations became even more difficult and unreliable. Radar could track aircraft position, but couldn't always provide the precision needed for time fuse settings. Proximity fuses eliminated this problem entirely, as the shell found its own target regardless of visibility conditions, and night kill ratios increased by 370% when ships used VT ammunition, while Japanese pilots who had previously used darkness as protection suddenly found themselves just as vulnerable as in daylight. Admiral William Halsey, commanding naval forces in the South Pacific, recognized the strategic implications immediately, because Japanese torpedo planes had been making devastating nighttime attacks on American ships throughout 1942, the darkness, protecting attackers and limiting defensive fire to wild barrages aimed at engine noise. With proximity fuses and radar-controlled gun directors, this advantage evaporated overnight, as ships could engage aircraft effectively in pitch darkness at extended ranges. Japanese aircrew losses mounted dramatically, and tactics that had terrorized the fleet became suicide missions. By late 1943, Japanese naval aviation was suffering unsustainable losses, partly due to the proximity fuse's effectiveness. Yet even as Navy ships reaped these benefits, Army commanders in Europe fought with one hand tied behind their backs, knowing the proximity fuse existed. Intelligence reports and liaison officers had informed them of the Navy's success. They knew it could save their soldiers' lives, and General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, had seen the statistics, but been refused permission to use it. The Pentagon's logic was based on legitimate security concerns that seemed reasonable at the time, because every artillery shell fired over land carried inherent risk. Some shells would inevitably malfunction and fail to detonate. Some would fall in contested territory where German forces might recover them. And if Germans captured even one intact fuse and successfully reverse-engineered it, the consequences could be catastrophic. German engineers might develop their own proximity fuses for anti-aircraft guns defending the Reich. And the American and British strategic bombing campaign depended on reaching targets deep in Germany. But if German flak batteries suddenly became 3 to 4 times more effective, bomber losses would become unsustainable, and the air war over Europe would be lost. Intelligence reports suggested German science was fully capable of understanding and replicating the technology if given a working example, because German electronics firms like Telefunken and Siemens had sophisticated research facilities. German scientists had already experimented with various proximity fuse designs, though none reached production. And there was also fear of German jamming technology, because if enemy scientists figured out the radio frequency used by the fuses, they might develop electronic countermeasures. False signals could trigger premature detonation or prevent fuses from working at all. The advantage would be neutralized and the secret revealed for nothing, so better to maintain strict operational security than risk these scenarios. And the Pentagon maintained its embargo through most of 1944. The Navy could use proximity fuses over deep water, where duds would sink beyond recovery, but the Army couldn't use them in Europe, where every shell mattered. And this decision had devastating consequences measured in American blood because time fused. Artillery in the European theater continued to require thousands of rounds to achieve meaningful results. German formations moved with relative impunity because Allied artillery lacked precision to stop them consistently. American soldiers died while a weapon that could save them sat in warehouses waiting for authorization that might never come. And Army commanders grew increasingly frustrated as 1944 progressed. They were fighting the Wehrmacht with inferior technology, while a war-winning weapon remained restricted, and General Eisenhower understood exactly what the proximity fuse could mean for his troops. He'd reviewed the Navy's combat data, showing threefold improvements in effectiveness. He knew American soldiers were dying unnecessarily because of what he considered overly cautious security policy. And he wasn't a man who accepted unnecessary casualties quietly. The military situation grew increasingly desperate by late 1944, because despite successful D-Day landings in June and liberation of France, German forces were far from defeated. They'd stabilized their lines along the German border and were preparing a massive counteroffensive unknown to Allied intelligence as Hitler assembled a strike force of 250,000 soldiers, nearly 1,500 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces in the Ardennes forest. The German plan, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, aimed to split Allied armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force Western allies to negotiate separate peace. And on December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, Germany launched its surprise offensive, beginning with a massive 90-minute artillery barrage that stunned American forces. 250,000 German soldiers, supported by secretly assembled tank forces, smashed into American lines along an 80-mile front. The assault hitting a thinly defended sector held by inexperienced and recuperating divisions. The 106th Infantry Division had just arrived from the United States. The 28th Infantry Division was recovering from severe losses in the Hurtgen Forest, and German armored spearheads led by elite SS Panzer divisions penetrated deep into Allied territory. The weather was terrible, with low clouds and snow preventing Allied air support. American forces reeled backward in confusion and near panic. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and American artillery fought desperately to slow the German advance. But time-fused shells proved woefully inadequate against infantry advancing across snow-covered open ground. Artillery observers struggled to provide accurate range data in the confusion. Too many shells buried themselves in soft earth and snow, detonating harmlessly underground. Too many German soldiers survived artillery barrages that should have destroyed. Entire units and German infantry advanced with confidence, knowing American artillery, while dangerous, wasn't the precision killer it could have been. 3 days into the German offensive with American forces in crisis, Eisenhower had seen enough and sent an urgent message to the Pentagon through General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, demanding immediate authorization to use proximity fuses in ground artillery. He argued the strategic situation overrode security concerns because if Germans broke through to Antwerp and split Allied armies, the entire campaign would collapse. The war would be prolonged by months or years, and the risk of captured fuses, terrible as it might be, was less than the risk of losing the campaign. The Pentagon relented with remarkable speed, and on December 21, 1944, all restrictions on proximity fuse use were removed. Within hours, 200,000 shells with VT fuses, codenamed POSIT to maintain some operational security, were released from depots and rushed to front lines. Artillery battalions received hurried briefings on the new ammunition. Most gun crews loaded the shells with no clear understanding of how they worked, only promises they were far more effective than anything previously fired, and the results were immediate and devastating. American artillery that had been marginally effective against German infantry suddenly became a precision killing machine as shells exploded perfectly at treetop height without requiring any time fuse calculations. Every round detonated at optimal height to spray fragments across maximum area. And German soldiers advancing across snow-covered fields found themselves in kill zones with no protection. Units that had felt relatively safe from time-fused artillery because heavy clouds prevented accurate observation now died in droves, and the bad weather that was supposed to protect them made no difference to proximity fuses needing no external targeting data. General George Patton commanded 3rd Army as it drove north to relieve surrounded American forces at Bastogne. His artillery battalions received proximity-fused ammunition December 22nd, and the very next day they put it to devastating use near Echternach in Luxembourg, where a battalion of German infantry attempted to cross the Sauer River to reinforce their offensive. Patton's artillery caught them in the open, and the new shells with the funny fuses, as Patton called them in his diary, killed 702 enemy soldiers by actual body count, the German battalion ceasing to exist as an effective fighting force. Patton wrote a letter to Major General Levin Campbell Jr., Chief of Army Ordnance, expressing his amazement at the new weapon, stating the new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think when all armies get this shell, we'll have to devise some new method of warfare. I'm glad you thought of it first. This wasn't hyperbole from a man known for dramatic statements. This was sober professional assessment from one of America's most experienced combat commanders, and German soldiers captured after proximity-fused artillery strikes described the attacks in terms of shock and complete helplessness. One prisoner from the 12th SS Panzer Division stated there was simply no defense against the new American shells exploding overhead with no warning raining fragments straight down, and men in foxholes and trenches, previously protected from artillery exploding on the ground, now died as steel fragments came from above. German commanders had no tactical response, couldn't adapt to a weapon eliminating traditional defensive positions that had protected infantry since World War I, and the 8th Infantry Division caught a German patrol in the Hürtgen Forest using a time-on-target barrage with proximity-fused shells, finding all 96 Germans dead. The patrol completely annihilated without a single survivor. Such devastating results multiplied across the front as American artillery battalions learned to employ the new ammunition effectively, and German offensive momentum ground to a halt by December 25th. The counteroffensive that was supposed to split Allied armies and win breathing space for Germany, instead becoming a catastrophic defeat that destroyed the last German strategic reserves. Allied anti-aircraft batteries also benefited dramatically from lifted restrictions as German aircraft making desperate close support attacks suddenly faced the same lethal technology that had ravaged Japanese air power in the Pacific, and 417 German planes fell to proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire during the Battle of the Bulge period. The Luftwaffe's last major offensive effort collapsed under losses it couldn't sustain, and air superiority, always tenuous for Germany by late 1944, became completely unattainable. The port of Antwerp demonstrated another critical application of proximity-fused technology because the Belgian port was absolutely essential for Allied logistics, handling more supplies than all other ports combined. Its capture intact in September 1944 had been a major strategic victory, but Germans responded with concentrated V-1 flying bomb attacks beginning in October. These primitive cruise missiles, essentially pilotless aircraft powered by pulse jet engines, flew at nearly 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. Their speed and low altitude making interception extremely difficult with conventional anti-aircraft weapons. But when proximity fuses became available for anti-aircraft batteries defending Antwerp, the equation changed overnight. Modified fuses designed specifically for low-altitude, high-speed targets turned defenses into a nearly impenetrable barrier. And in one 24-hour period, 48 of the first 75 V-1s approaching Antwerp were destroyed by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. The success rate climbed to nearly 80% as gun crews gained experience with the new ammunition, and the vital supply port remained operational throughout winter 1944, enabling Allied forces to maintain their advance into Germany. Without proximity fuses, Antwerp would likely have been rendered unusable, potentially stalling the Allied offensive for months. The British capital also benefited enormously from American proximity fuse technology because London had suffered terribly under V-1 attacks beginning June 1944. The flying bombs caused extensive damage and civilian casualties, threatening to break civilian morale, and British anti-aircraft defenses initially struggled to intercept them, effectively destroying less than 20%. American proximity fuses rushed to Britain and integrated into British anti-aircraft guns, transformed defensive capability almost overnight, and by end of August 1944, anti-aircraft batteries equipped with proximity fuses were destroying 79% of all incoming V-1s. During 1 week in August, guns using proximity fuses destroyed 82% of V-1s targeted, and London was saved from a weapon that might have forced consideration of evacuation plans. In the Pacific theater, the proximity fuse's importance grew even greater as Japanese tactics evolved into organized kamikaze attacks, because by October 1944, Japan had lost most of its experienced pilots at the Battle of the Philippine Sea and other engagements. The Marianas Turkey shoot in June had cost Japan over 600 aircraft and most remaining trained aviators, and conventional attacks by poorly trained replacement pilots stood little chance against American fighter cover and ship defenses, with loss rates exceeding 80%. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, formally organized the special attack units known as kamikaze on October 19, 1944, and the first unit, the Shimpu Special Attack Corps, consisted of 24 volunteer pilots flying bomb-laden Zero fighters. Onishi told the pilots they were already gods without earthly desires. Their mission was not to return, and these units used aircraft as guided missiles, piloted by men who accepted death as the starting point of their mission. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred October 25th, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when Lieutenant Yukio Seki led 5 Zeros against American escort carriers off Samar. and one kamikaze crashed into escort carrier USS St. Lo, detonating in the hangar deck among fueled aircraft. The ship exploded and sank within 30 minutes with loss of 143 crew members. Other kamikazes damaged carriers Santee, Suwannee, Kitcun Bay, and Kalinin Bay, and the psychological impact on American sailors was profound and immediate because this wasn't warfare as they understood it. Naval commanders immediately recognized proximity fuses would be critical against this new threat. Emergency orders went out to equip every ship possible with VT ammunition. Production priorities shifted. Ships heading to the Pacific received priority allocation of proximity-fused shells, and gun crews received special training on engaging kamikaze aircraft, emphasizing sustained fire at maximum range, using proximity fuses to create a wall of exploding shells. The kamikaze threat was both terrifying and initially effective, because pilots who accepted death at the outset couldn't be deterred by defensive fire. They would fly through flak and fighters, absorbing damage that would force conventional attackers to turn away. They required only enough control to reach their target in the final seconds. And at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, kamikazes sank escort carrier USS St. Lo and damaged numerous other vessels. The psychological impact on American sailors was profound. But proximity fuses proved uniquely effective against kamikazes for reasons that became clear through combat analysis, because the suicidal nature of attacks meant Japanese pilots flew predictable straight-line trajectories directly toward their targets with no evasive maneuvers, no complex approach patterns, no pulling away at the last second. This predictability played directly to the proximity fuse's strengths, and 5-inch guns firing VT ammunition required only 310 rounds per kill against kamikaze attackers compared to 624 rounds per kill against conventional attacks. The simpler trajectory, giving fuses more opportunities to detect and destroy incoming aircraft. The Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945 became the ultimate test of anti-aircraft defenses against mass. Kamikaze attacks as Japan threw everything remaining at the Allied fleet supporting the invasion, and nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties attacked American ships over 3 months of desperate fighting. The Japanese called these mass attacks kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemum, and launched 10 major waves. And on April 6th alone, 355 kamikaze aircraft attacked the fleet with scale that was unprecedented and initially overwhelming. American naval forces suffered the highest casualties of any Pacific campaign, with 26 ships sunk and 164 damaged. Nearly 5,000 sailors died, and another 5,000 were wounded. But without proximity fuses, the losses would have been catastrophic rather than merely severe. Nearly 2/3 of all VT fuses expended during the entire war were used in just 7.5 months of 1945. Most of them in waters around Okinawa, and those fuses shot down over 1,200 Japanese aircraft that otherwise might have crashed into American ships. The invasion succeeded, but at a cost that influenced American planning for invasion of Japan itself, and post-war analysis by the operations research group concluded definitively that proximity-fused shells were 3 to 4 times as effective as time-fused ammunition in anti-aircraft roles, with some specific scenarios showing even greater advantages. 5-inch naval guns firing conventional time-fused ammunition required approximately 2,000 rounds to destroy one aircraft in typical combat conditions, while the same guns using proximity fuses required between 300 and 600 rounds, depending on tactical situation. And against kamikaze attacks, specifically, the advantage was even more pronounced, with some engagements showing 5 to 10 times greater effectiveness. The proximity fuse provided a psychological advantage harder to quantify, but no less real, because Japanese pilots facing intense proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire knew even near misses could be lethal. The sky filled with airburst explosions that seemed to track their movements with uncanny accuracy. And German soldiers in Europe learned to fear American artillery in ways they hadn't previously. The shells found targets conventional ammunition missed, They exploded at exactly the right height, regardless of weather or terrain. There was no safe place, no reliable protection, no tactical counter, and the proximity fuse also validated a revolutionary model of military research and development that would shape American defense policy throughout the Cold War and beyond. The project demonstrated conclusively that civilian scientists, given adequate resources and clear objectives, could solve seemingly impossible technical challenges. And the collaboration between academic researchers at Johns Hopkins, industrial manufacturers like Crosley and Sylvania, and military planners had produced a war-winning weapon in under 3 years, from initial concept to mass production. The industrial achievement was as impressive as the technical innovation, because the proximity fuse program represents one of the greatest production miracles of World War II, comparable to the B-29 bomber or Liberty ship programs. And at the program's peak in early 1945, over 110 factories operated by 87 different companies participated in proximity fuse production. This vast network employed over 100,000 workers, most of whom had no idea what they were building. And the production story began modestly in August 1942, when Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati received the first production contract. Powell Crosley Jr., who had made his fortune in radios and refrigerators, converted his entire factory to fuse production within weeks under extraordinary security as workers passed through multiple checkpoints wearing color-coded badges, restricting access to specific areas with mail censored and phone calls monitored. Workers were forbidden to discuss their jobs even with family members. Many thought they were making improved radio tubes for military radios. And Crosley's plant became a model for mass production efficiency, with assembly lines divided into stages and workers trained on single operations they repeated thousands of times. One station wound tiny coils, another soldered connections with microscopic precision. Quality control inspectors checked every 10th unit. And by December 1942, Crosley was producing 500 units daily, climbing to 3,000 daily by December 1943 and reaching 16,500 fuses every 24 hours at peak in April 1945. RCA entered production in September 1942, converting a facility in Bloomington, Indiana. Their expertise in radio manufacturing proving invaluable as RCA engineers developed improved assembly techniques, reducing production time by 30%. And Eastman Kodak's contribution went beyond assembly, because their expertise in precision optics and chemistry helped solve problems with photoelectric cells used in some fuse variants, while also developing improved plastic components that could withstand temperature extremes. General Electric operated multiple facilities with their plant in Schenectady, New York, assembling complete fuses, but their most important contribution came from a converted factory in Cleveland that had previously manufactured Christmas tree lights. And this facility produced the tiny tungsten filaments used in vacuum tubes, working to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, where a single imperfection, invisible to the naked eye, could cause fuse failure. Sylvania Electric Products became the backbone of tube production with their plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, employing 10,000 workers in 3 shifts operating continuously except for Christmas Day. And the plant consumed enough electricity to power a small city, while special air filtration systems removed dust particles that could contaminate tubes. Workers wore special clothing to prevent static electricity, and the plant produced 95% of all proximity fuse tubes, manufacturing approximately 1 million tubes every 2.5 days at peak production. And by war's end, Sylvania's Ipswich facility alone had produced 5,683,032 complete fuses, more than any other single location. Major corporations worked alongside dozens of smaller specialized firms as McQuay Norris. Manufacturing company in St. Louis produced metal components. Zenith Radio Corporation in Chicago assembled electronic modules. Wurlitzer, famous for organs and jukeboxes, manufactured precision timing mechanisms. And even Lionel Corporation, known for toy trains, produced specialized components. Each company brought unique expertise, contributing to solving production challenges. And by war's end, American industry had produced 22 million proximity fuses at a total cost exceeding $1 billion in 1940s currency, with cost per fuse dropping dramatically. Through mass production efficiency, early hand-assembled fuses cost $732 each, making them more expensive than many automobiles. But by 1945, assembly line production and manufacturing improvements had reduced unit price to $18. And this 40-fold cost reduction made the weapon economically viable for widespread use. Even at $18 each, proximity-fused shells were cost-effective when their dramatically improved kill rates were considered, and quality control was obsessive throughout the program, as every batch of fuses underwent rigorous testing at multiple stages. The National Bureau of Standards operated special testing facilities where fuses were subjected to temperature extremes from -65 to +160 degrees Fahrenheit. They endured humidity chambers, salt spray tests, vibration tables, and centrifuges simulating firing conditions. And random samples from each production lot were actually fired to verify functionality. The failure rate had to remain below strict thresholds. Any batch showing problems triggered investigation of the entire manufacturing run, and this attention to quality ensured fuses performed reliably in combat, from the Arctic to the tropics. The secrecy surrounding the proximity fuse held remarkably well throughout the war, because despite millions of fuses being fired in combat, Axis powers never successfully reverse-engineered the technology or developed effective countermeasures. And German engineers captured some dud shells in late 1944, but couldn't believe the fuses actually worked as advertised. The idea of functional radio equipment surviving inside an artillery shell seemed so improbable, they assumed captured examples were elaborate deceptions or failures. They spent resources investigating countermeasures against fusing techniques Americans weren't actually using. And the Japanese faced similar, but even more insurmountable barriers. They captured several DoD proximity-fused shells during Pacific campaigns, particularly from naval bombardments that fell on land despite regulations. And Japanese researchers understood the basic principle, but their electronics industry lacked capability to replicate the extreme miniaturization required. The gap between American and Japanese industrial capabilities had grown so wide by 1943 that even with working examples, Japanese industry couldn't produce equivalent weapons in meaningful quantities before the war ended. And Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, reflecting on the proximity fuse's contribution to victory, stated it helped blaze the trail to Japan. General Eisenhower, writing in his memoirs, stated that if Germans had perfected and used proximity fuses 6 months earlier than we did, the invasion of Europe would have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. And these weren't casual observations, but strategic assessments from the highest levels of military command. Men who understood the narrow margins separating victory from defeat. Yet for nearly 2 years, Army commanders were denied access to this war-winning weapon because of institutional caution that, while understandable, proved excessive because the Pentagon's security concerns were legitimate, and the risk of German reverse engineering was real. But the decision to maintain the embargo while American soldiers died with inferior weapons represented a failure of strategic judgment. It prioritized theoretical future threats over immediate present casualties. And only when the military situation became desperate enough during the Battle of the Bulge did leadership approve what should have been authorized months earlier. The proximity fuse represented more than just a weapons advancement, because it marked a fundamental shift in how military technology could be developed and deployed, proved that electronics and automation could enhance conventional weapons to extraordinary effect, demonstrated that small technological advantages properly exploited could determine the outcome of entire campaigns, and most importantly, showed that innovation required not just brilliant science, but massive industrial implementation and institutional courage to deploy new capabilities despite risks. The sailors aboard Helena, who fired those first combat shots in January 1943, couldn't have known they were inaugurating a new era in warfare. They simply knew their shells were hitting targets that should have been impossible to engage. But the officers who commanded those forces, the generals who deployed them, the admirals who organized naval task forces around their capabilities, they understood something fundamental had changed. Warfare had entered a new phase where technological sophistication mattered as much as courage and numbers. And in under 3 years, American researchers and manufacturers created a weapon that changed warfare, produced it by the millions, deployed it across 2 theaters of operation, and used it to help win the largest conflict in human history. The weapon the Navy initially kept to itself became the weapon that helped save the Allied cause when it mattered most. The innovation Pentagon leaders feared to deploy became essential to victory. And that progression from impossible to essential stands as testament to what human ingenuity can achieve when the stakes are survival itself. The proximity fuse reminds us that transformative, military advantages often require overcoming not just technical obstacles, but institutional resistance and bureaucratic caution because innovation delayed costs lives. But when finally unleashed, revolutionary technology can change the course of history itself. The legacy of the proximity fuse extends far beyond World War II, because every modern anti-aircraft missile uses proximity fusing as standard equipment. The Patriot missiles that defended against Scud attacks in the Gulf War used proximity fuses descended directly from the Mark 32. Naval close-in weapon systems like Phalanx that protect ships from missile attack employ proximity fusing. Air-to-air missiles carried by fighter aircraft worldwide detonate using proximity fuses. And the technology pioneered under desperate wartime conditions became fundamental to all modern air defense. The scientists who developed the proximity fuse went on to shape American science for generations. As James Van Allen discovered the radiation belts bearing his name, many Section T researchers became leaders in the space program. The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, created for the Proximity Fuse Project, continues as a leading defense research institution, and the model of university, industry, and government collaboration established by the Proximity Fuse program became the template for American technological development throughout the Cold War. Most importantly, the proximity fuse saved countless lives because naval historians estimate that without proximity, Fuze's American casualties in the Pacific would have been 30 to 50% higher. The kamikaze threat might have forced cancellation of the Okinawa invasion. The invasion of Japan itself, planned for November 1945, might have faced insurmountable losses from suicide attacks. And in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge might have succeeded in splitting Allied armies without proximity-fused artillery. London might have been evacuated under sustained V-1 bombardment. The war might have continued into 1946 or even 1947 with millions more casualties on all sides. And the proximity fuse stands as proof that sometimes the most important victories come not from courage alone, though courage is essential, but from the marriage of scientific innovation and industrial might. 22 million tiny radars, each no larger than an ice cream cone, helped win the largest war in human history by solving a problem that had seemed impossible, turning the vast empty sky into a killing field for enemy aircraft and giving Allied forces the edge they needed when they needed it most. And the guns that fell silent in 1945 still echo in every missile that flies today, still whisper in every defense system that stands watch, reminding us that the impossible becomes inevitable when brilliant minds refuse to accept defeat.